Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Stone. I'm the chairperson of the Massachusetts Sierra Club Political Action Committee, and I want to welcome you to tonight's event. This is our first ever fundraiser, so please bear with us a little bit. As for the event, well, I'll begin by telling you that the planning of this fundraiser began in earnest last fall, and if it had not been for a certain global pandemic, we'd probably all be mingling in the nice living room of a Sierra Club member, having cocktails, maybe some food, enjoying getting to know each other, learning about our PAC, discussing state politics. But now, well, now we're stuck with Zoom. But despite my growing antipathy and maybe yours too towards Zoom, we're nonetheless very excited that it has presented us with the opportunity to hear from our amazing guest speakers, Representative Liz Miranda and State Rep candidate Amber Hewitt. But before we get to them, I'd like to share with you a bit of information about our new PAC and a few reasons why I think our mission is just as important, or even more so now than prior to the pandemic. In addition to me, our PAC currently is made up of a board of 4 other members who I'd like to introduce now. We have our media director, Carolyn Conley-Dass.
Hi, everyone.
We have our Massachusetts Sierra Club Chapter Liaison, Celia DeRemus.
Hi.
Our campaign liaison, Mimi Locke.
Hello.
And direct from Western Mass, our treasurer, Lily Lombard.
Everyone, good to see you.
Thanks. So all of us on the board are volunteers. In fact, we have very little operating expenses, meaning that a very high percentage of donations goes directly to campaigns. And it's one reason why, if you're able to, you should consider donating to the PAC. What we basically do is work with the Massachusetts chapter to identify what we refer to as priority races in state elections. These priority races are between candidates who will truly champion the environment and opponents, especially incumbents, whose record demonstrates complacency or even worse when it comes to the environment. And what we mean by candidates who will champion the environment are those who will protect the environment in a just way, including by promoting as part of their platform certain specific Sierra Club 2020 priorities. And you can find more information about these priorities on the chapter website. And once we identify these candidates, we support their campaigns. We do that directly with funds that they can use to generate things like mailers, other campaign literature, and with intern support to help them run phone banks, target voters, run their campaign more efficiently. What we really want to do is flip those seats. We do this because our core belief is that Massachusetts should be a leader in the fight against climate change, should be a leader in the transition to clean energy, and should be a leader in the fight for environmental justice. And overall, we are not. For instance, despite being considered a progressive state, Massachusetts has not signed into law any significant comprehensive legislation on climate change since 2008. And I could get into the many reasons for this, but we don't have the time, obviously, and I really don't want to subject you to that kind of lecture. Briefly, I'll just say that for people in the know, one of the reasons is a lack of transparency at the State House, and specifically the fact that committee votes are not public. And so when environmental bills die in committee, and it's documented, they have, despite widespread public support and even support of our governor, none of those individual committee members is held accountable. If you're interested in learning more about the lack of transparency at our State House, you can email the PAC or the Mass chapter with your questions. We'd be glad to answer them. But what I can tell you is that the Massachusetts Sierra Club PAC, we make sure that every candidate we support is for changing this, for pledging to support an open meeting law that requires votes of individual committee members to be made public, to be on the record, so we can hold them accountable. That's really kind of a roundabout way of presenting another reason why I urge you to consider donating to the PAC. Working with the Massachusetts chapter, we do the legwork to dig deep into platform issues and reasons why we're not doing better here in Massachusetts at leading on the environment. And we incorporate that knowledge into identifying priority races and the candidates running in them who we will support. The final thing I'll share a little about is our take on why the pandemic has added to the urgency. And that's really the elephant in the room. And by room, you know, I'm talking about the Oval Office, right? And the elephant I'm speaking about, Donald Trump and his enablers. It's not a secret that Trump has pushed hard for eliminating environmental protections, deeming them business unfriendly. But he is amping up that push, claiming that environmental protections stand in the way of the economic recovery. And if you don't believe me, just read the current issue of the Sierra Club magazine. And so what does that have to do with state elections? Well, we know that he is making federal funding conditional on states supporting his agenda. And that pressure, we have to make sure that we have state legislators who will not acquiesce in any way to that kind of pressure. Because if we do nothing to combat climate change, to do nothing about raising issues of environmental justice where we can, well, I assume that because you're all here, I don't have to tell you the result, but I will. I can't help myself. We will see things like ocean levels continue to rise in our lifetime and our children's lifetime. And not only is this a concern to our coastal communities here in Massachusetts, but it is to the world. I've heard this directly from John Kerry, from former Secretary of State, who's launched his own climate change initiative with Arnold Schwarzenegger, Madeleine Albright. They're that concerned about this issue. The predicted number of people that will have to leave coastal communities, for example, and just to put it in stark terms, I mean, it will make the Syrian refugee crisis look like people going on a picnic. So for all these reasons and more, we need your help. And please know how much we appreciate your support and how pivotal each and every donation will be as we continue to get this PAC and its work moving forward. Okay, enough from me. On with the program and our guest speakers. Hopefully they're still awake, they're still here. So on to them. After we share with you a quick video about Sierra Club's priorities and the great work you can support by helping us elect pro-environmental candidates.
All right. I hope you all enjoyed that quick little video about some of Sierra Club's work and priorities. And I would just like to say also thank you so much to our two guest speakers for being with us tonight. We're really excited to have you here. We're going to start with Amber Hewett. Amber is a Sierra Club endorsed candidate running for state representative in the 1st Essex District, which includes Newburyport, Amesbury, and Salisbury. A lifelong environmental activist, Amber has spent the majority of her career at the National Wildlife Federation, where she gained extensive experience advocating for clean energy policy. She played an integral role in passing the Commonwealth's Act to Promote Energy Diversity in 2016, carrying the nation's largest offshore wind power commitment to date, and has since advocated successfully for offshore wind policies in Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey. Amber joins us tonight to talk about the urgency of climate change, her experience with how COVID-19 has impacted her campaign strategy, and the importance of Sierra Club support as she campaigns to flip a seat this fall. So now I'm going to hand it off to Amber.
Sorry, Amber. Every time I unmute you, it remutes you, so just, there you go.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Emma. And thank you, Carolyn and Mike. Thank you to all of the board members. It's really, I'm thrilled to be here and honestly quite honored to be here at your first fundraiser and to be sharing the stage with Representative Miranda. I know I'm not alone in saying that she has quickly become a hero of those of us following the legislature closely. And she, you, Representative, give me hope, and you give my community hope. So thank you for that. I'm really looking forward to hearing your remarks. So thank you, Carolyn, for that introduction. I'm joining you today from my home in the 1st Essex District here in Newburyport, which has been home to my family for 4 generations. My grandfather was born and raised here, and he grew up to be the city's first building inspector. And he was the building inspector at the time when our city had just endured 2 devastating fires and was in major economic decline. And the leading sentiment among decision makers at that time was to bulldoze the city and start from scratch. My grandfather wasn't comfortable with that suggestion, and even though he saw the beginning of that effort, wrecking balls showed up in town and tore down historic landmarks, he continued to speak up and advocate for taking a new course. And for those of you who have been to Newburyport, you've seen the impact of that decision. And we now, 2 generations later, I live in what is a beautiful historic seaport community, a tourist destination, and somewhere where you feel the history when you walk through our community. And my grandfather passed away when I was 11, but I spent the first decade of my life absorbing that ethic from him of speaking up when something doesn't sit well with you and the difference that it can make when you do. And so while my grandfather saw wrecking balls tear down buildings in his community, my generation has watched homes fall into the ocean as climate change reaches our shores here on Plum Island and Salisbury Beach. And we now need to speak up with something that isn't sitting well with us. So learning about climate change in high school, seeing the devastation striking our shores with sea level rise and stronger storm surges and having it hit my very community, the one that my grandfather fought so hard to protect, I felt it, a fire in my heart spark that only burns brighter today. I learned about the climate crisis at a young age, and it has shaped my life. I turned 30 on Sunday, so it has shaped half of my life now. It directed me to study political science and climate science at UMass, and then ultimately to start my career with the National Wildlife Federation in Washington, D.C. And while I was there, we were just starting this campaign to advocate for the responsible development of offshore wind power, which remains to this day a largely untapped US opportunity. When I started my career, we had not a single offshore wind turbine in US waters, despite the fact that it was a booming global industry. But, and today we still only have 7 turbines in the entire United States offshore wind fleet. So we have an incredibly long way to go. But the campaign drew me back to Massachusetts earlier than I expected to, because the barriers that were in place to our offshore wind industry were state policy barriers. We needed to dismantle one by one these energy policies that had been set up to obstruct an industry that requires really significant investment in port infrastructure and in the local workforce and in local communities to transform the United States coastline to be able to launch and support this industry for the long term. So I eagerly came back to Massachusetts and have been working on state level clean energy policy ever since 2013. And some of you may be surprised to hear this, but I actually really found a love for state legislatures, and I felt an infusion of hope coming from DC and then working at the state level, because we had such traction in the early days of this campaign, and it wasn't without a hard fight. When I first arrived back in Massachusetts, no one wanted to hear about offshore wind power. There had been a decade-long battle over one project that was within the sight line of the Kennedys and the Kochs, and it never took off, and it really put a sour taste in the mouths of even clean energy advocates in Massachusetts, because it was a fight that people had been embarrassed by, had gone out on a limb for. And I was told, no one wants to hear about offshore wind power. It's not going to happen. It's unsightly. There's too much opposition. It's too expensive. And I knew that throughout the course of our fight in Massachusetts, this industry had advanced into something that we needed to seize the opportunity of. And I worked with partners across the Commonwealth to really build a coalition, not just of environmental advocates, but of labor leaders. This is incredible job creation opportunity. And of business leaders, because it's an incredible rate stabilizing opportunity when we're talking about something that can replace half of our energy supply in the region. So that effort, met with champions inside the building, ultimately delivered an early and unlikely victory in Massachusetts in 2016. The Act to Promote Energy Diversity was to date the nation's largest commitment to offshore wind power. But what really inspired me and sparked my love for state legislatures and state policy work was what happened after that. And that I work for the National Wildlife Federation. We had been advocating beyond Massachusetts for offshore wind policy. And after that bill passed in Massachusetts, our conversations in the other states across the region and along the coast, all of those conversations changed, because we weren't asking them to do something new and go out on a risky limb, but they were asking us, what does Governor Baker know that we don't know? Why did he sign on to this? Why did he do this first? What's the story here? And we were able to ultimately, as Carolyn mentioned, get offshore wind policies passed in Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Maryland, Virginia. And those may have been possible without Massachusetts leading the way, but I'm certain that they would have taken much longer. And of course, each policy has been better than the one that passed before it. So we actually have a lot of improving to do upon the policy that exists in Massachusetts. And that is, it's part of why I'm here, but ultimately I decided to run for office because of that experience over time, reinforcing for me that persisting toward progress in one state can actually have an impact far beyond our own borders. And that as someone who's kept up at night by a global crisis, sometimes a state can feel like a really small canvas, but our canvas is as big as our ideas are good. And by good, I mean inclusive and equitable, and the coalitions that we build to advance them. But what we also need, as you all know, are champions inside the building. I have been in so many conversations, as most or all advocates have, where we dilute our ask before we even have a meeting with a decision maker to make it what we know will be politically palatable, to make it something that won't get us laughed out of a room or told that we're greedy. And I was having a conversation like that with advocates and partners just before I made the decision to run for office. And I had this moment of feeling like I need to run for this seat, because if I have the honor of representing my district in the Massachusetts legislature, I hope that no one ever has a conversation like that before coming to meet with me. We need to be electing people who can hear the scale of the challenges we face and who are committed to advancing solutions that rise to them, because otherwise, what else are we doing? So why does that matter, and how do I bring it home to the 1st Essex district? Why is it important in every district across the Commonwealth? Because after 2016, I saw, as I'm sure many of you did in your own home communities, a groundswell of activism, the likes of which I had never seen here in Newburyport. I have seen I mean, shortly after the 2016 election, our city halls, our churches, our senior centers were full of people desperate to learn how to resist what was coming our way. And that may be common in certain more urban or younger communities, but in my community, a fairly affluent suburb, mostly older, that wasn't a common experience. It felt different here. There was an energy here that had changed. I went to meetings where there were people in their 70s and 80s who were learning eagerly the basics of the Massachusetts legislature and how to be an activist. And they prepared themselves for meetings on an issue that they cared about. And they went to meet with their state representative, and their conversation ended on Green Street in Newburyport in their state representative's office with a "thank you for coming. Keep an eye on the Massachusetts legislature website. Have a nice day." And I started to see this activism turn into defeat because they were hitting a wall in their own community. And our elected officials have an incredible amount of control over how hopeful we feel. And that is what I started to see in my community, that it wasn't just about what was happening in the White House. It was about how their activism was being received in their own city. And that amount of control over a person and a community's hopefulness is an incredible responsibility. Our state representatives need to be gathering the strengths and struggles of our communities, delivering them to Beacon Hill, and delivering them as collaborative action. And that is not happening in the 1st Essex District. So this campaign has been about, and continues to be about, reminding my community that our government is nothing but people making decisions, and that different people will make very different decisions, and that should make us feel hopeful, because that is the power that we have in the decision that we get to make. So while this campaign looks completely different than I imagined it, as all of our lives look different than we imagined they would this summer, we can't canvass, we can't gather, we can't reach a hand out to a person who's sharing a struggle. There's a lot that we can do and are doing, because frankly, the urgency and the uniqueness of this moment only increases the urgency of the message that we're bringing, that there is now a greater understanding in this district of the danger of government inaction. And there is a new richness to conversations here because of what we're living as a community, struggling alongside everyone else. So we are phone banking multiple times a week. We've sent 1,000 postcards to members of our community. We've been holding signs weekly, spaced out and masked, but covering good amounts of area and really building some energy and visibility. We are preparing to do no contact drops of literature. We have built a groundswell on social media, largely with the help of an incredible team of interns and fellows, one of our interns from the Sierra Club, and fellows that we have been able to gather from middle school, high school, and college students who are spending more time home than they expected to this summer. We have held multiple Zoom events and fundraisers, and we've actually started holding a handful of small backyard or front stoop gatherings. We're doing something that we're calling stoop halls, mini town halls on someone's front stoop with a very safe and small number of people. And we're simply just meeting people where they are. We're building momentum. I feel the traction that we have, it's resonating, and I am confident that what we're building will bring us to success in November. We're challenging an entrenched third-term Republican incumbent, and he has held the seat by very narrow margins, the first time by just 10 votes. And we are operating now in an incredibly different world than he has ever run for office in. And we intend to really rise to this moment and deliver the option of the kind of representation that this moment demands. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Amber. That was incredible. Thank you so much for that great talk. And before I forget, happy belated birthday. So you just talked a lot about your work on offshore wind energy and the great legislation that was passed in 2016. We are going to do a little bit of question and answer. We gave our guests the opportunity to pre-submit questions through the registration process. So all of these questions come right from our audience members tonight. And I'm going to kind of combine a couple of questions because we actually did get quite a few on wind energy. So one of our questions is, what progress have you seen being made in Massachusetts since 2016 on wind energy, and what are your immediate goals going forward in the next 5 years?
There we go. Thank you. Yeah, so we blazed a trail in the Commonwealth in 2016, and we set a goal of 1,600 megawatts of offshore wind power, which is enough for just under 1 million Massachusetts homes. And a couple of years later, in the 2018 session, we actually doubled that goal. So it's now 3,200 megawatts, enough for just under 2 million homes. But that has since been eclipsed by New York, New Jersey, and Virginia, all setting larger goals and all moving forward at a faster pace than we are. Also, those states have passed policies more like the one that we originally advocated for but didn't fully achieve, which actually require that projects are built with standards in place to protect wildlife, for example, with fair labor practices and project labor agreements. So pieces, and we've yet to pass a policy that includes environmental justice provisions in the decision-making process. So what we really need to do in Massachusetts, and what will be on my docket if I'm elected, is pass a bill that doesn't just say, let's build the cheapest offshore wind we can build, because we have developers in the mix like Shell and formerly Statoil, now Equinor, who can build a really cheap project because they have the ability to subsidize their own price and therefore win bids. But what does that do for the Commonwealth? We need to make sure that Massachusetts workers build these projects. We need to make sure that such large scale energy development plays a part in correcting the mistakes of our past and our unjust energy decisions. And we need to make sure that we're protecting endangered wildlife while we build these projects, because we cannot solve the climate crisis while recklessly worsening the species extinction crisis, and we don't have to. So we know these projects can be built responsibly for wildlife and for people, and we need to pass a bill that requires that. That should be a barrier to entry in Massachusetts. It shouldn't be an option. Right now it's an option. It gets you bonus points on your bid. So that's what needs to happen. There are a couple of projects in the queue for development. There have been 2 solicitations. Winning bidders have been awarded contracts. So there are 2 projects in the queue. We have a major, the elephant in the room that Mike referenced is significant for offshore wind as well, because all offshore wind development will take place in federal waters. It ultimately needs to be permitted by the federal government, and the current administration has not indicated that they will approve offshore wind projects, and they've been a barrier the whole time that they've been in office. So we really, in order to unleash this opportunity, we need to change the occupant of that building. So.
Great, thank you. That was a great answer. Our second question comes from Alex, and the question is, who are some inspirational people who have come before you in politics, and why?
Oh my goodness, how much time do we have? Yeah, that is an excellent question. So I have been a longtime follower and supporter of Senator Ed Markey. I started college in 2008 and therefore followed very closely every bit of the Waxman-Markey climate bill that should have changed the course of history. And I say often that we would have, that we are where we are with the climate crisis, as we are with so many crises, because of government negligence and malfeasance over time. We knew this problem was coming before I was born and didn't make the choice to change course. So when I say things would be different had we chosen better people to make decisions along the way, I really think of, had Senator Markey been able to build the kind of coalition needed to get his bill over the finish line, had he not been an exception, but rather had been the rule, that we elect ambitious Congress people and senators who aren't afraid to rise to a challenge. I also do really have some sources of inspiration in the Massachusetts State House. I worked very closely throughout the offshore wind fight with Representative Pat Haddad, and she wasn't a likely friend of mine. She actually called herself the Queen of Coal before we started working together. And so I had my preconceived notion about her before I started working with her. But she needed to replace a retiring coal plant in her community. She needed to replace those jobs and that tax revenue. And she saw offshore wind as an opportunity to do that and was willing to entirely redefine herself as the Witch of Wind, to learn the damages of her decisions in the past and to really step up to make this bill happen. It would not have happened without her. I talk a lot about her on the campaign trail and her willingness to work with people that she doesn't align with on much else. So the ability to, I call her out because I really do admire and intend to bring to this work the ability to compartmentalize disagreements and focus on the work, because I think we have no other option right now. In such a polarizing time, we need to focus on the work.
Great. Thank you very much. I thought that was a fun question. And again, just thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm sure your campaign schedule is extremely busy, so we just really, really appreciate you taking the time to join us and speak to us and answer our questions. So thank you again, Amber.
No, thank you so much for having me. Really glad to be here.
Of course. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to another PAC board member, Mimi, who's going to introduce our next speaker.
Hi, I'm Mimi Locke, and I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Liz Miranda, Representative Miranda. Thank you for being here so much, Liz. We're thrilled to have you here. Liz is an example of what can become of Boston's young people when they're given the opportunity to rise above their circumstances. As a first-generation Cape Verdean American and lifelong resident of Roxbury, which is part of the 5th Suffolk District that she now represents, Liz is a Wellesley College alumna and graduate of the John D. O'Brien School of Mathematics and Science in Roxbury. A youth champion, community organizer, and philanthropist, Liz's career in both community building and youth development began as a teenager living in the Dudley Street neighborhood. She's been a staunch advocate for gun violence prevention, environmental justice, economic empowerment, and for women and girls of color. Elected state representative in November 2018, Liz assumed office and sits on several joint committees. Her representation and voice elevates marginalized citizens to be a part of a government that values opportunity for all. In fact, she's the lead sponsor of the EJ bill, the Environmental Justice Bill, H. House 761, called an act relative to environmental justice and toxics reduction in the Commonwealth. And Liz is Sierra Club endorsed. Welcome, Representative Miranda.
Good evening, everyone. I had to turn off my camera because I needed a sip of wine. You know, no fundraiser goes well without wine and cheese. But thank you. It's a great honor to be here this evening. And thanks to Amber for really sharing really robust information about one of the tenets of when we think about the environment. I'm going to start my story in 1980 and just talk a little bit about why I consider myself an environmental justice champion. Really not because it was the most convenient thing to do when I got into the State House a year and a half ago, but because of my lived experience, almost a life and death situation for me. I grew up in the Dudley Triangle. There are 2 movies and a book about my neighborhood here in Roxbury. The book is called Streets of Hope, and it talks about the founding of an organization called the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. And the 2 movies are called Holding Ground and Gaining Ground, about a little community in Roxbury called this Dudley Triangle. Many people, if you've been to Boston, hear about Dudley Street or Blue Hill Avenue. And this was this little corner that most of the Cape Verdean immigrants, my parents are West African and came here in the 70s, but Massachusetts has really had a long history with Cape Verdeans since actually whaling. And for over 200 years, Cape Verdeans have come from the west coast of Africa to the Cape, to towns like Carver and Harwich in Rhode Island, because we were great seamen. And then eventually our families came and joined. And we also worked on cranberry bogs here in Massachusetts. And growing up in this community, I wanted nothing more than to leave this community because we were severely an environmentally unjust community. We were the dumping ground of Boston. We had construction debris, raw meat. We had dozens of illegal trash transfer stations. We are right off the highway 93 South. We have 5 times the asthma rate than the rest of Boston. We died 33 years before our brothers and sisters here in the Back Bay. Growing up, I had 1,400 parcels of vacant land because most of the community had been Irish and Italian, and because of white flight, many of them participated in something called arson for profit. And that's something that they're not very proud of. But the community got this vacant land because houses were literally being burned to the ground. And as this community in the 70s, as Blacks moved from the South End into Roxbury, as Puerto Ricans came into the South End and other communities, really there was very little community here. We suffered through redlining and multiple pollutants that left us with bad air, bad land, bad water. And growing up here, I really thought there was no hope. I knew we were poor. I didn't realize how poor we really were until I walked onto the campus of Wellesley and I said, God damn it, there's a whole lake. There's a whole lake. This place is surely green. Even though it was 10 miles away, I had never been to the town of Wellesley and hadn't really realized that Massachusetts had this stark difference between those that had and those that had not. But the silver lining in the story, and the reason why there's 2 books, 1 book and 2 movies, is that this community organized itself and was one of the first communities in the nation to have eminent domain power over its land. And over 15 years, I was able to see a community that I thought had nothing, that I had to escape from, empower young people to help fight. We fought everyone from the Boston Planning and Development Organization to the attorneys, and we used to see these guys come in with suits and briefcases, and we won eminent domain, and we were able to build over 250 homes so people could buy them. We built 2 schools. We've revitalized our community, and the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative is still standing there today as a place that teaches resident leadership and community organizing. And I share all that because I learned 3 things very young. That environmental justice work is racial justice work. The greatest correlation to toxicity is race, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. 2, that there is no climate fight without ensuring that communities like mine are involved. Oftentimes when people think about climate change fight, you know, they think of sort of a white hippie, right? And someone who's like gonna hug a tree, or Green Roots and trying to fight, not Green Roots, but the organizations that are stopping all types of bad stuff happening around the world, and not really realizing that there's different types of communities that have always suffered when we don't believe in science, when we don't engage people in their own leadership to, you know, turn the tide in their own communities, and folks who are disproportionately impacted. We saw COVID hit our state really hard. I myself, 20 members of my family got COVID because my title could not shield me for the decades-long environmental injustice that's happened in my community. I lost my grandmother. I feel that I've paid an ultimate sacrifice being a resident of Roxbury and of Massachusetts. And so when I walked into the State House, many folks, you know, thought that I would just be pursuing sort of what they would consider Black issues. And I had to do a lot of education to teach people that environmental injustice is a Black issue. There is nothing in our system that isn't connected to our environment. If we have a trash transfer station or a hazardous waste plant or if we live off of highways. I was really happy to see in that video when they talked about premature deaths. When we talk about maternal justice, where Black women are dying 2 times the rate of white women in Massachusetts and 4 times the rate of other white women across the nation, when we have preterm births, when our children are also dying at an alarming rate, all because of not only access to poor public health and health care that is racist, but because of where we live. If buses are idle, if highways are full of cars, if we have communities that are poor and are incredibly violent, these are things that cause trauma and stress that lead us to having unhealthy futures. And I, for one, know that I could not fight for the criminal justice reform that I want, to ending mass incarceration, to work on immigrant rights, and all these things that I want to work on without first addressing our environment. So I'm happy to say that when a week ago or a week and a half ago, I can't remember because I've been on a little bit of a break, when Amendment 52 was passed out of the 2050 roadmap for climate, I was so proud to see that environmental justice was actually uplifted there, because I felt strongly that that was a win for communities like Chelsea, like Brockton, like Roxbury and Dorchester, that have suffered for a very long time, have been segregated, and we have not as a state enforced. When you talked about, Mike, some of the things that you're fighting for, implementation and enforcement is a thing worth fighting for, because if we pass laws that are detrimental, but if we also pass good laws and policies that we don't make sure actually happen, they do not happen. I'm one of only 3 Black women in the entire legislature of 200 seats in the Mass House and Senate. I know representation is not everything, but it also is not nothing. And I know that I'm fighting for communities that are often felt like they're unseen and unheard. So consider me a friend on every issue that has to deal with saving our planet, but particularly around the issues that uplift the people that have been suffering for a very long time. There are 137 environmentally just communities, or what you call environmental justice communities in Massachusetts, that have 25% or more people of color, that have 25% or more English isolation, which are also low income and poor communities. There are other communities in environmental justice, including Lexington, that has a large population of Indian Americans. But what we're really focusing on here is when those 3 combinations are together, English isolation, low income or poor, and also of color, who is fighting for those individuals here in Massachusetts so that they can stay alive long enough to fight with you, to fight for making sure that there isn't enough erosion happening. There isn't erosion happening in our seaside towns, and that there is not, making sure that we have the clean energy and the electric vehicles that we need. So I hope that you guys will join me in this fight. I've enjoyed my 17 months in the State House, partnering with folks like Michelle Dubois out of Brockton and Adrian Madaro out of East Boston, and the environmental justice organizations, including CLFR and Green Roots and ACE here in Roxbury, to make sure that we have a better future. So thank you all.
Thank you, Liz. That was wonderful. And thanks for sharing your background of how you grew up in Roxbury and those years, and then going off to college in Wellesley, and then all your efforts moving forward, and now in the State House. I also jotted down the name of the book and the 2 movies that you mentioned, Streets of Hope, the book, and then Holding Ground and Gaining Ground, the 2 movies. I'm gonna try to look those up. So the first question I have out of 2 questions is on social justice issues and EJ issues. Now, these issues have been amplified in our society during the pandemic. Do you think that these matters that are pretty out front right now during the pandemic, do you think they can be sustained as a priority once this pandemic subsides? So how do we keep society's attention on these priorities?
I think one of the things that I've really instituted the entire time that I've been in the State House is to make sure that I elevate these issues each and every time that I get a platform, whether it's through social media or through meeting with advocates or meeting with leadership, that the only way that they sustain and are continued to be elevated is if all of our folks who are fighting for different justice and equity initiatives are actually speaking the same tune. I have been told many times that when I say things like there's no climate justice fight without the EJ fight, that it somehow feels nouveau, but it is not nouveau. This is not something new. Communities have been long impacted by redlining and segregation and racial injustice. And many of those folks in those communities have needed champions who live in more well-to-do communities to say, hey, I want to fight for this issue in my community, but I see you and I hear you in your community, and I'm here to help. So I think we have to elevate this. Sorry, this is the inner city. My doorbell rang, but I'm back.
Okay. So Liz, I'm going to go on to our second question if you're all complete. Sure. Okay, all right. My second question has to do with the Mass State House. What's your view on the efforts to make our House more transparent and responsible to voters? How do you think you can push this effort forward?
I think the first thing we must do as Massachusetts voters is stop living this lie that we're a very liberal blue state. In fact, we're very moderate and we're very purple. And because we have a lack of representation, I'll just share some numbers. You know, Massachusetts State House, you know, and our government was founded in 1636. It wasn't until 1973 until a Black woman was elected to office. And she started the Women's Caucus and also the Black and Latino Caucus, and her name was Doris Bunce. We also have a situation where there are only 18 representatives of color out of 200 seats. If we were to count Black, Latino, and Asian American colleagues, that is not nearly enough to fight for the communities that are largely of color in the state of Massachusetts. And so what we have to begin is actually invest in electing people that are more progressive to push the House and the Senate to be more transparent. You know, one of the things that I shared with some of my progressive colleagues is that just because someone says they're progressive doesn't mean they're anti-racist. And that is a big, challenging, uncomfortable, when you talk about an elephant in the room, to have a conversation with folks to say, I believe in many of the things that you believe in. However, you have not done right by my community and people of color. And there's still room, I haven't given up, but that there has to be a radical shift in how we see women, how we see people of color, and folks who represent communities that don't have the means. You know, I talk about a lot about protesting and coming to meetings and Zoom meetings. Many of the people in my community, because it is 52% foreign born and 62% female head of household, the median income in Roxbury is $24,000 a year. They don't have the time to make some of these conversations that they really want to be a part of. And that, because they're not there, doesn't mean that they don't care, but we have to meet people where they're at. And so in the fight for transparency, I've shared a lot with my colleagues who are very progressive, that in my community, they don't even see the value of making committee votes, you know, public, because they haven't been taught or haven't been engaged in why this is important. In fact, they didn't even know what a state representative was and what a state representative did until I spent thousands and thousands of dollars, you know, thankful to my Wellesley sisters and folks who really believed in me, to actually turn out the vote and educate people that the reason why I want your vote is because the State House and state legislatures are not only places where laws are made or corrected or amended, but also where resources come to your community. And if Roxbury and Dorchester has never gotten its fair share of the state millions and millions of dollars, then we can't expect it to be on the same fighting playing field. And so this economic injustice is very much aligned with racial injustice and also environmental injustice. And I have tried to speak about these things equally together. And therefore, I'm educating my own colleagues around when you want to fight, for us to fight together, we have to remember that not everyone is on the same equitable playing field. And if we want to fight for all these issues on the 2050 roadmap, we got to start educating people in inner city communities and also educating people in suburban communities to really understand the plight that is happening. I live in Roxbury today. I have a great education. I have a great career. I definitely don't make $24,000 a year, but every time I walk out of my community, I'm confronted with the issues of violence, of food insecurity, of how COVID and access to healthcare and fresh, affordable food is an important issue. And our environment matters because it's continuously impacting us. So I hope that was a long-winded answer, but I hope that folks have seen my trajectory in the last 18 months. Some of my colleagues make fun of me and they're like, you're so well liked that, you know, you could get a meeting with the speaker anytime and with leadership. And that's not the case. What the case is that I have been authentic in my approach and in my story from day one, that I am not here just because I wanted to be a representative and be in state office. I am here because people are dying right here in Massachusetts because we're not doing the right thing.
Okay, thank you so much, Liz. That was wonderful. Yeah, thank you for all of that in your talk. And I hope to get to meet you in person at some point, as well as you, Amber. And I wish you both the best in your campaigns. And I'd like to turn it now over to Celia, because it's getting near the end of our meeting. So thank you.
Hi, everybody. This has really been great. And Representative Miranda and Representative Candidate Hewitt, you were both terrific. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your insights on environmental justice and the fight for clean energy. To all of you who attended this first Massachusetts Club PAC fundraiser, your participation helped us make a little history today. We appreciate your donations, and if you haven't already donated, feel free to do so now. As others have said this evening, we're going to use these funds to help flip critical seats in the Massachusetts House, Senate, and local offices. Our goal is to elect environmental champions to replace the people of leadership positions who aren't doing anything for the environment. So we'll keep you updated on the outcome of the elections and our endorsed candidates. Please know again how much we really appreciate your support. Thank you, stay safe, and have a wonderful night.